many of the side effects that they experience when correcting this are due to the biological consequences of chronic inflammation. It's important to support and adjust the TRT and supplement protocol for the patient in terms of where they're at now based on their different state of health at baseline. Daily injections actually do lead to a natural slight fluctuation in levels because of these pharmacokinetic peaks. So just like caffeine has a half-life of 8 hours, it doesn't have a gradual increase at up to 4 hours and then a gradual decrease in the desired effects. Okay, everyone, welcome to my Troubleshooting TRT lecture. This is a re-recorded version of the 2023 lecture I did on troubleshooting. And this is, I think, a very important topic to cover for a variety of reasons. I believe, and in fact, I know from experience, that there's probably two general camps of people online who are looking for these kinds of videos. One is for people who are looking to learn about TRT before starting, which I think is a great thing to get a general understanding about. But the other group of people who are seeking knowledge or content or answers on YouTube are people who are experiencing maybe side effects or lack of resolution of symptoms or potentially some disappointed expectations from what they hoped to achieve from TRT. And this lecture was one that I did a couple of years ago. It was actually recorded in August. It is currently October, so actually just over 2 years ago. And when I was going through these old lectures that I was wanting to re-record for better quality, as well as adding more experience and knowledge to the foundation, I had noticed that someone made a comment asking if the video was recorded underwater. And rather than making some kind of snide comment that, I was busy hanging out with SpongeBob in his studio or something like that, I did note that this could have been a better quality recording, and I think it's very important to record this in a way that people will be able to easily consume, because the knowledge and the content is extremely important. And I think there are a lot of points here that still aren't being talked about enough, if at all, via other platforms. So I'm going to get into this. As with my previous re-recordings of these lectures that I've done in the past, I haven't looked at the slides. I don't really know what I'm getting into. The sun is going to set as we go, so the lighting is going to change a bit as the video goes on. This will be a one-hit wonder, and we are going to get into this. I'm not sure how long I'm going to be keeping you here. You'll know better than me because you can see the timestamp at the end of this video, but I hope I'm not going to keep you too long, and I hope I can answer more questions than I can raise for you in this complex and nuanced discussion of how TRT may be causing some problems or lack of symptom resolution, and ultimately how you can either investigate or resolve these issues. So let's start with the overarching question of, well, what causes problems on TRT? And this is a much broader topic because there are a lot of factors at play. The first thing that I think is very important to drill down on is this gap between expectations and the reality of treatment. So as I've covered in my previous lectures that you may have seen, if you haven't, I would suggest watching the Your Brain on Testosterone lecture series. But ultimately, TRT is building the foundation. It doesn't build the house. So when you restore or give yourself for the first time optimal testosterone levels, this is not going to be a magical panacea to all of your problems. It will solve the problems that are directly being caused by a hypogonadal state, but a lot of the time, the real outcomes of treatment that people are hoping to achieve actually come from the work that needs to be done on top of having this corrected foundation of endocrine health. So TRT will give you the results that you deserve from your inputs and outputs, whether that is sleep, training, nutrition, hydration, working on your mental health, working on your overall competency in life as a man. But it is not going to do all that work for you. And I think that this is a really important point to note from what I've seen working with thousands of clients over the years, is that a lot of the time people are expecting that once their levels reach the point in their blood that they deem to be optimal, or their provider deems to be optimal, that all of a sudden they're going to be this completely changed human that embodies all of these different positive masculine attributes. And ultimately that can come to fruition, but not only does TRT take time, but it also takes time to do this work. Now, the other point that I think is also very important, and this is something that comes up all the time, and I would say that this is one of the most common causes of side effects that maybe is a little bit less straightforward than just increasing your frequency of injections, which is that the overlooked cause of usually secondary hypogonadism in younger men hasn't been resolved. So if the body is actively suppressing your testosterone production, it is not in a biological state that is primed to metabolize and utilize the optimal testosterone levels that you are administering exogenously, whether it's via injections or topical, or if you're using another terrible form of administration, I guess that can also be the case. But the analogy that I've used, and this might be the first time you hear me saying this, or it might be the 1,000th time you've heard me say this. I've actually done an entire lecture on Cars, the movie, which I think is a very good analogy for how humans work. It's kind of like a sentient car or a sentient machine. It's kind of like putting a sports car engine into an old bomb of a car, like a Suzuki Swift that's completely broken down, smoking out of the bonnet, needs a service. And instead of servicing the entire car, it's simply coming in and saying, well, I'm going to whack a sports car engine in there so that it drives faster. And the second aspect of this, which is more complicated because humans are not simply just machines, we also have free will and we can make decisions. A lot of the time, the decisions that we make are not conducive for our long-term health, but can be beneficial for feeling good in the short term, is that TRT in this analogy also doesn't teach you how to properly drive the car. And maybe the reason the car is damaged is because you drove it badly for a while. Now, again, there are many reasons why men have hypogonadism that are intractable. Maybe it is age-related hormone decline. Maybe it is to do with damage to the testicles from an injury, or chemotherapy if someone has had testicular cancer. But in practice, particularly in the demographic that is on YouTube a lot of the time, there is an unresolved root cause of why the testosterone was low to begin with. And when the provider comes in and simply goes, yep, your levels are low, let's bring them up. If the body is in a state in which that production was actively being suppressed for a reason, we are now creating a disconnect and we're working against the body rather than working with it. And this is not necessarily a reason not to do TRT. I mean, if someone had a time machine or they haven't pulled the trigger yet, it's definitely a reason to see, okay, can I fix this thing to see if my levels come back to optimal? But if someone has already pulled that trigger and is 6 months, 12 months, a couple of years down the road, again, using the car analogy unintentionally there, it may be a matter of saying, how can we work with the body and with the testosterone levels to meet the medicine halfway? And I want to go through some of those actual pragmatic, strategic things that pop up so that people can actually solve this problem, not just understand the philosophy of why this is going wrong in the first place. So undiagnosed or chronic medical conditions which are not properly managed, this is also a big one. If you've got something going on in other aspects of your health, particularly what I see a lot is things like mismanaged chronic pain and injuries, physical dysfunction in the body. People are throwing peptides at themselves rather than actually doing rehabilitation exercises. Maybe hypothyroidism isn't properly managed. Maybe there's an issue with the liver that actually needs treatment. There can be all these other situations going wrong with the body. If you come in and optimize the testosterone levels, in a lot of cases, that may actually help the other condition. But depending on what's going on, it could actually make the symptoms of the other condition worse because you're stressing part of the body which is already under stress. Now, the other very common root cause, which I've spoken about a lot, and you can watch my TRT 101 lecture, you can check out the ebooks, I put a variety of resources online about this, is shit protocols. It doesn't matter how optimally you are living your entire lifestyle, or if all of these aspects are properly dialed in, if you're injecting a mil of testosterone once a week, or you're using pellets, or you're using Testogel, or your levels are too low or they're too high, or the protocol is just completely all over the place. That is a much easier thing to fix, but unfortunately, the standard of care and expertise of a lot of practitioners and clinics globally is extremely substandard, and it's the actual protocol itself that can cause these issues. So I want to come back to this expectation management because this is really important. So in 2025, TRT, which is, the time I'm recording this, you may be watching this in the future. If so, hello from the past. But TRT is a very marketable thing. When I first entered the industry, actually, let's backtrack even further. When I first started TRT as a patient, it wasn't really a thing. There wasn't YouTube stuff about it. It wasn't common knowledge. If I told people and said, I'm on TRT, they'd go, what's that? Now, TRT is kind of like a household term. People know what it is. And I think ultimately this is a huge positive. But it's important to recognize, and I can speak from this with expertise because my original undergrad degree is in marketing, is testosterone is a very marketable thing to a man, both in terms of the testosterone molecule itself and what we perceive as being attached to having higher testosterone levels. I liken this to selling a thirsty guy in the desert a glass of water. Almost every man wants more testosterone, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's actually a good thing. And if it wasn't for the shutdown of natural production, if it wasn't due to the regulations around TRT, if it wasn't due to it being a bit more of a commitment than other, supplemental interventions, it would be a much more straightforward and a much more popular treatment option, even more so than it is now. But the problem that we have is that because a lot of practitioners and clinics and business models are simply running off a basis of wanting to be as profitable as possible, TRT is often sold to patients with false expectations. It's sold as a panacea. It's sold as a miracle cure for all aspects of physical and mental health. And testosterone is beneficial for all aspects of physical and mental health when done properly, but it is not a miracle solution to everything else that may be detrimental to that. So the gap between expectations and reality can be problematic because when TRT is not doing what you wanted it to do as fast as you wanted it to do it, or both, it can lead to people becoming frustrated. It can lead to people adding things to their protocol or changing their protocol haphazardly and reactively. And this can ultimately lead to more problems. So while TRT is undoubtedly a tool to help resolve a lot of issues with a man's health, there are generally two sets of symptoms in hypogonadal men. Symptoms which are primary to the hormone deficiency, and then symptoms which are secondary to the hormone deficiency. And it is crucial to understand that while TRT may flip the switch on biological issues directly impacted by testosterone itself, it can take months and even years of work to undo the damage to the body and the mind that come from a prolonged state of low testosterone. And this state of low testosterone often leads to poor self-care because as a result of feeling terrible, this leads often to people coping with this in a way that is maladaptive. And this is part of being a human. The problem is that this can actually compound and become a root cause problem in and of itself, especially if these maladaptive behaviors and coping mechanisms become habituated into someone's identity, into someone's routines, and then they ultimately become the embodiment and outcome of this poor pattern of self-care. So it's very important for me to restate this, and I'm probably going to restate this a bunch of times. So, bear with me. TRT does not do the work for you. It allows you to receive the results you deserve. Nothing more, but also importantly, nothing less. So there's this honeymoon period that a lot of men get on TRT. And this is, I would say, neutral. It is not good. It is not bad. It just is. And some people get it. Some people don't. Some people say it's placebo. This is nonsense. It is very, very real. There can also be placebo aspects to it too. But if you are using enanthate or cypionate, although it does take 8 to 12 weeks for levels to fully build up in the body, you are still getting a significant spike in androgen levels very early. If you don't believe me, go and get a blood test 24 hours after your first injection on TRT, and you will see that your levels are significantly elevated. The thing that people need to understand is that if you do achieve this honeymoon effect, this can kind of lead to a mentality where people chase the dragon. And this is a term that people often use in drug addiction and recreational drug use, where the first time someone uses the drug, it can be much more euphoric than the habituated pattern of behavior due to receptor changes and changes in neurochemistry as a result of repeatedly administering a compound. But it's very important to understand that if you do get a honeymoon period, that this is going to be something that feels like taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But if you take 2 steps forward and 1 step back, you've still taken 1 step forward. And the alignment of expectations needs to be that that 1 step forward is a positive, not that the 1 step back, which still nets you 1 step forward overall, is a negative. So TRT does not work properly without creating a human being who would naturally have these optimal testosterone levels. It is paramount for patients to understand just how much work, effort, and time is going to be required to meet their expectations. And this can be a difficult pill to swallow, because I've seen a lot of people and I've spoken to a lot of people who have this mindset that if you take testosterone now because you're administering it exogenously, you don't have to really do all the stuff that you would need to do to have those levels naturally, like looking after yourself properly, sleeping enough, not drinking alcohol, eating well. And I get this, because from a layman's perspective, this makes sense. I don't think this is stupid, but it's wrong. I wish it wasn't this way, because my job would be easier. Everyone who I know who works in the industry would have an easier job, and every patient of TRT would have better outcomes. We would all like that. But sometimes in life, actually all the times in life, things are not that simple. So the gap between the levels of testosterone that you are taking and the levels of testosterone that you would be producing, the gap between these two levels is side effect territory. And the thing that we have to understand as compassionate people who are working with men on improving their health is that it takes time to improve this. And it's often a lot of mental work, it's physical work. Even if someone starts doing everything right tomorrow, they still need time to be the outcome of being the guy who's done all that stuff positively. So there is a period of time that it takes to bring the body into a state of optimal health. And this is something that people need to expect, people need to understand, and people need to factor into the journey of starting TRT to say, if I want to achieve, ABC, XYZ, whatever goals I have, I need to be willing to actually do the work that will allow me to achieve those results. So TRT unlocks a capacity in order to achieve these results. It doesn't deliver the full potential of treatment without the patient, as I said before, meeting the medicine halfway. It just doesn't. And that's just the reality of it. So TRT will not force the body into becoming an optimally androgenic, high testosterone man. In fact, if chronic diet and lifestyle patterns are not congruent with this, there will be just as many side effects as benefits, because you've put your body into an equally unnatural state as having low testosterone. So a really good kind of guideline and time frame to look at, because if you set expectations a bit lower and more realistically, you have the opportunity to have those expectations exceeded. So TRT takes at least 6 to 12 months of stable optimal levels to begin to take full effect. And it takes years to fully manifest. So patients must understand that the benefits of TRT actually lie in the chronic androgen exposure, not just the acute subjective effects of starting TRT at first. So many of the benefits that people are actually looking to achieve come from the trajectory shift resulting from more energy, more resilience to stress, and improved recovery. The benefits come from what are you going to do and who are you going to become when you have this improved biological resilience and capacity. So I'm going to break this area down into practitioner considerations and then patient considerations. So the thing that practitioners need to do is inform their patients or clients of this prolonged timeline of results, as well as lifelong dependence and the responsibility to adhering to protocols and blood testing instructions. It's really important to educate clients of the importance of becoming healthy overall, to look and feel the way that they're wanting to, and to ensure that they understand that testosterone is not this magic pill. I also really strongly believe from practice, actually, it's not a belief, it's knowledge. I know this, that if you are going to work in this field, you need a referral network of personal trainers, coaches, even psychologists, allied practitioners, physiotherapists, specialists that are understanding of TRT that you can refer your patients out to. And that way the patient can correspond with them on that area of expertise. And then they can come back to you so that you can manage that as a central point of care for the patient. It's really important to work as a team. If you want to be a jack of all trades, you will inherently be a master of none. Now, when it comes to patient considerations, one thing that I think is a really good mindset to adopt and to push into your brain is that the men that you look up to, who are the way they are, that you want to be more like, that you want to emulate, you want to be more like them and less like how you are in your hypogonadal state, they are the result of the long-term habits required to maintain that natural optimal androgen level, combined with the exposure to long-term chronically elevated androgens. So if you're really far off track with your diet and your lifestyle and your self-care and your overall health, that means that this will take more time and more work for you to resolve this. So adding more testosterone, adding more supplements, adding more medications, this will not actually solve or allow you to get away with problems that come from diet and lifestyle. So this point that I brought up before that I'm going to come back to and spend a bit more time on is this unresolved coping mechanism for the physical and mental effects of low testosterone, because this is very real. So, and it really goes double for if testosterone was low during the formative and developmental years. We have this new cohort of men that are growing up hypogonadal. They're developing physically, they're developing identity-wise, they're developing in terms of their mental framework and their perception of the world in a hypogonadal state. And many of the side effects that they experience when correcting this very, very rapidly are due to the biological consequences of chronic inflammation, which would naturally suppress the body's testosterone production, then combined with the high levels of exogenous testosterone that have come in seemingly out of nowhere to the body. So these underlying pathologies impact the way that the androgen and estrogen receptors work. They impact their sensitivity, they impact the production of aromatase, they also impact corticosteroid production, prolactin production, reverse T3 production, and the dopaminergic processes of the brain. There's a lot of stuff that is going on that is impacted negatively as a result of long-term hypogonadism, both itself and then the secondary habits that often accompany that. So testosterone is not the only system in the male body. And when you put testosterone in, how it is metabolized, how the receptors work, how the enzymes are produced that metabolize testosterone into things like estrogen and DHT, as well as the other factors that impact dopaminergic production, stress hormone regulation, all of these things are still variables that are impacted by testosterone, but in other aspects are still independent. So when you put a bunch of testosterone into an unhealthy body, this can lead to things like hypertension, secondary erythrocytosis, bloating, water retention, hyperhidrosis, which is like excess sweating, mood disturbances, cognitive issues, insomnia, issues with circulation, libido, digestive problems. All of these things can arise when you rapidly throw the body out of balance with where it had been achieving this homeostasis, this balance. And even if this balance wasn't good, it wasn't healthy, it wasn't where you want to be or where you should be, it is still a very big and rapid flux. And it's important to understand that identifying the root cause is only half the battle, because it actually takes months and years to then correct the habits or correct the underlying issue and then be the outcome of that being corrected. So it's important to support and adjust the TRT and supplement protocol for the patient in terms of where they're at now based on their different state of health at baseline. And this is something which I think is massively overlooked. And to me, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. So I'm going to go through some of the common causes of secondary hypogonadism. And this is just the stuff that you see. So obesity, alcoholism, SSRIs and antipsychotic medications, chronic pain, especially from intractable injuries, previous anabolic steroid use, especially SARMs prior to the age of 25, chronic exposure to xenoestrogens during development, obesity during puberty, poor diet and lifestyle, poor health of the parents, either in utero and prior to conception, long-term micronutrient deficiencies, chronic psychological stress, sleep deprivation, including sleep apnea, hypothyroidism, and drug abuse. Yes, that is including cannabis. So there are some supplements that can help this period of adjustment. And the ones that I've seen help the most have been things like NAC, glutathione, phosphatidylserine, CBD, TUDCA, depending on how you want to pronounce that, melatonin, over-the-counter anti-inflammatories like glucosamine and MSM, ubiquinol, which is the bioavailable form of CoQ10, and high-quality, high doses of omega-3 fish oil. There are also medications that can help, things like tadalafil, metformin, telmisartan, when used appropriately in the right contexts. Now, there's interventions that can also help, and the biggest one by far, and I've got this in capital letters on my slides, and I'm going to reinforce that over the last 2 years working with thousands more men, this is absolutely the biggest one: losing excess body fat. If you are obese and if you are not at a lean, healthy body fat percentage, you are much more inclined, and past a certain point, I would argue, guaranteed to experience at least suboptimal outcomes, if not side effects. So losing body fat is not easy. It's not easy at all. And it's easier when testosterone replacement therapy is in place because this supports the metabolism, but the work still has to be done. So things like personal training, increased cardiovascular training, meal prep services, counseling, mindfulness meditation, various forms of resistance training, self-development practices, again, losing body fat, comprehensive blood testing and assessment, personal coaching in terms of helping people actually work on their habits and their lifestyle factors, removing vices, particularly alcohol and drugs, increasing your low-intensity daily movement like step count, mobility work, and then high-quality nutritional supplements. And again, I'm going to say it for a third time, losing body fat. So again, this now is speaking to both patients and providers. The comprehensive, in-depth blood work and medical history analysis must be performed to ensure optimal HRT protocols and ongoing management. If you want to do TRT as a patient, or if you want to prescribe and oversee TRT as a provider, comprehensive blood work is a must in order to guarantee optimal outcomes. Otherwise, you are just setting sail on the open ocean without a map and just hoping for the best. Might work out. Chances are not in your favor. Now, most complications that I have worked with personally to resolve with clients have been oversights from either only running a very narrow blood work panel or simply the provider not spending enough time or effort going through the patient's complete history, not just their medical history, but their life as a whole, their daily habits, their nutrition, their sleep, their stress, their hydration. All of these things are extremely important. If you don't ask a patient how many alcoholic drinks they are drinking per week, and you're sitting there scratching their head, wondering why they're having all these side effects, this is something that you're never going to solve unless you have the right information. And you're not going to have the right information unless you ask the right questions, and patients need to actually be honest with their providers in terms of where they're at. So if a provider is not skilled in interpreting all hormones and comprehensive metabolic panels, they should learn how to see the red flags on blood work. And if they're not at that level, they need to refer to allied providers. So the most comprehensive blood panel is only useful to a practitioner who actually knows how to interpret and apply what it means. So patients, and this is a really big one, and I'm going to double down on this because this is even more of an issue now than it was 2 years ago, and it was a big issue then. Patients must not attempt to solicit personalized medical advice from Facebook groups. It is impossible, and that goes double for the comments as well, even on this video. It is impossible for strangers to diagnose and treat medical conditions. And for you as a patient to know every aspect of what is relevant to your symptoms and side effects when you are asking for help. So use social media and use these YouTube videos for education, not for a diagnosis. So the next thing I want to talk about here are these undiagnosed chronic conditions. So TRT will not solve problems which cannot be directly resolved by increasing androgen levels in and of itself. So my friend Dr. Charles Barnes has this great saying, and it was a great saying a couple of years ago, and it's still a great saying: if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And a big one here is insulin resistance and also obesity. You know, they tend to come in pairs, as well as NAFLD or either non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which abbreviates to NAFLD, or alcoholic fatty liver disease. Hypothyroidism, chronic pain, and psychological issues are often diagnosed due to their symptomatic presentation as anxiety and depression. And these are the 5 most common conditions that I see in practice complicating TRT. Now, it's really common for men to try to biohack their way around these issues, whether it's conscious or unconscious. However, if the root cause is not resolved, there will always be some degree of underlying dysfunction, and there will also be an over-reliance on these biohacking coping practices. So a really important point to understand is that it is impossible to feel your best mentally without being in optimal health physically. There is an extremely complex, interconnected relationship between what's going on up here, how you're feeling in your head, how you are mentally experiencing and subjectively experiencing your life, and your physical health. They feed back towards each other. So if you are physically unhealthy, you will not have optimal mental health. It's just not possible. So if you don't understand how a symptom and a pathology are connected, it doesn't mean that they're not connected. So focus on improving the areas that you know need to be improved. This is a really easy step 1. And there's a whole lecture that I've done on this, which is this idea of simply stop doing all the things you know you shouldn't be doing and start doing all the things you know you should be doing. Understand that you're just not going to get away with whatever it is that you don't really want to look at. And if you're not sure what those things are, it doesn't mean you're stupid. It just means that you haven't been properly educated on this area. You don't know what you don't know. So I have a whole lecture on this. I will have my videographer put a link up to it, maybe over here or something, and you can check that out if you would like a guide on what those common factors are that people tend to be overlooking. So this obesity and insulin resistance is a really big one, especially in the United States. And this can be measured via a variety of tools or blood tests, whether it's your body fat percentage, your fasting insulin, your HbA1c, ideally all of these things together. Triglycerides is also helpful as a multifactorial panel and a situation to look at in determining if insulin resistance is pathological. So further markers of dysfunction in this area can be elevated hemoglobin and hematocrit even when well hydrated, hypertension, so high blood pressure, elevated triglycerides, as I said, elevated prolactin, sleep apnea, depression, anxiety. Being overweight causes varying degrees of insulin resistance depending on how overweight you are. And what this does ultimately, from a very simplified and layman's perspective, is that it interrupts the body's ability to burn glucose for energy, as well as tapping into stored body fat for fuel when the liver becomes fatty in particular. This creates an internal state of biological chronic stress. When we often talk about stress, we talk about psychological stress. We talk about relationships or work or not sleeping enough or having a lot of shit going on. But if the body is biologically stressed in the sense that it cannot access and utilize energy properly from glucose at a cellular level, this causes an overactivation of the sympathetic nervous system. So basically, your body's stressed all the time because doing basic stuff is more difficult than it should be. And when you have this constant state of the body struggling all the time to generate and utilize cellular energy just to do basic stuff, this becomes like a death by 1,000 cuts thing. It becomes a big problem over time. So what this leads to, in terms of if people want to get into the nerdy stuff, is further imbalances in the GABA and glutamate pathways, a resistance to dopamine, reduced production, synthesis, and increased reuptake of dopamine. And then ultimately what you end up experiencing is this chronic state of low mood with heightened stress and anxiety. It's not a fun time. So it's really important to look at proper education around nutrition, around exercise, around stress management, around self-care. You need to know how to do these things and how important they ultimately are. And it's crucial that people understand this key point that I've said before, and I'm going to keep saying it, is you need to understand how you got off track so that you can understand how to get back on track and how much work realistically it's going to take to fix this issue. I constantly see maintenance effort with the expectation of transformational results. So it is integral that people understand how much support and how much compliance is needed in these overall areas. You've kind of got to do everything to improve your overall holistic, and I know that word gets kind of a little bit of a bad rap because it's been bastardized, but holistic meaning the human as a whole. You really have to work on everything and you have to do it consistently over time. It's also really important that providers test thyroid and DHEA, as well as other markers of chronic stress, especially if there's a lot of workplace stress, things like shift work is a big one, or intractable pain from injuries. DHEA and thyroid replacement absolutely will expedite and facilitate the results of TRT if there is a deficiency in these areas. I find phosphatidylserine, 300 to 600 milligrams per day, as well as magnesium glycinate, 400 milligrams twice per day, can be extremely helpful in situations when that stressor, such as having toddlers, being in a shift work career, having an intractable injury, can't be resolved. Some people can't fix the stresses that they have to deal with. So we have to work with them. So NAC, 600 to 1200 milligrams twice a day, can also be very helpful for people with low mood and energy issues while the body fat is being reduced, because this improves the antioxidant balance and reduces the oxidative stress neurologically. Other things can be helpful, like mixed forms of vitamin E, ubiquinol. I like ubiquinol at 100 milligrams twice a day, and 2 to 4 grams minimum of EPA DHA per day can also be very helpful to bring the omega-3 index up to anywhere from an 8 to 12%. And this can help. This doesn't solve, this helps. Now, if someone is overweight, I am a big fan of the short-term use of metformin. Metformin is extremely beneficial for reducing a lot of the negative metabolic side effects from the hormone testosterone itself when the individual is obese. And this medication can then be withdrawn once the individual reaches an optimal healthy body fat percentage. Now, I'm going to come back to this liver disease issue, particularly around fatty liver. I have referred many clients back to their general practitioner or to their TRT doctor to have a liver ultrasound to diagnose and ultimately treat fatty liver disease. Now, this point has a bit of contention, and it has contention because the science is wrong, and I think it's wrongly applied. So if people disagree with this, you can disagree all you like. You can even make your own video rebuttal if you like, or you can come on the channel and debate me on it. I would love to have the discussion. I have seen research that suggests that elevated bilirubin has nothing to do with fatty liver disease. This is bullshit. And the reason why this comes up is that elevated bilirubin does not mean that you have fatty liver disease. It may mean that you have something called Gilbert syndrome. And Gilbert syndrome means that you have elevated bilirubin without the presence of fatty liver disease. I think that it is an extreme intrinsic lack of understanding around the liver, around bilirubin, around how the body actually works, to assume that someone has Gilbert syndrome without first doing an ultrasound to check to see if fatty liver is present. Ultrasounds are quick, easy, painless, very affordable. And if someone is at a risk factor for having fatty liver disease, either from obesity or high alcohol consumption, and there's elevated bilirubin, and especially if there's elevated GGT, and if there are side effects from treatment, if it's already been initiated, it is so important just to get the ultrasound. Test, not guess. Scans are very useful for ruling things out. So AST and ALT may be elevated, but not always. And AST and ALT can be elevated from a variety of things. They're not just elevated from liver issues. This is a very, very silly assumption that people make. But they can also be elevated from this, but GGT is often elevated with fatty liver. But when in doubt, just get the ultrasound. Now, NAFLD can be the root cause of insulin resistance and obesity, but it can also be caused by insulin resistance. And my hypothesis in 2023, and I stand by this, is that a long-term choline deficiency can also be a root cause for why some people will develop NAFLD, the non-alcoholic form, which precedes the obesity and insulin resistance developing. So NAFLD, or alcoholic fatty liver disease, will prevent insulin resistance from being resolved. And when I say prevent, you absolutely can lose weight with this condition. It's just much harder. Because what this condition does is it increases gluconeogenesis and it disrupts fatty acid metabolism. But in the context of TRT, especially injectable testosterone, where the ester is attached to the testosterone molecule to be cleaved in the liver, which is dysfunctional, it will disrupt the liver detoxification process, leading to decreased clearance of xenobiotics, including estrogen, xenoestrogens, and their metabolites, as well as reducing the conversion of T4 to T3. So while telling people simply to lose weight, yeah, that'll fix it, but it's not that easy. And it can be much more effective for people to actually treat the NAFLD rather than just trying to lose weight in spite of it. So NAFLD often will not resolve on its own, and it prevents the weight loss from occurring based on when the individual is exercising properly and eating at what should be a caloric deficit. Now, choline and inositol work very effectively over an 8 to 12 week period to clear fat out from the liver. I have worked with many clients on this. I am going to give credit to Dr. Rand McLean for making a video on this many years ago. And this absolutely does work in practice. Now, adding things like TUDCA, glutathione, NAC, all of these are helpful in supporting the dysfunction of the liver, but they don't correct the fatty liver itself. This is kind of like using a crutch for a broken leg. They will help support the fact that the leg's broken so that you can do leg-related stuff, but they're not actually going to purge the fat out from the liver. It's the choline and inositol together. So I recommend getting the Now Foods choline and inositol. It's a 250 milligram of each capsule. So 250 choline, 250 inositol per capsule, and using 4 to 6 capsules of this product twice per day for 8 to 12 weeks. And you can do this and have a follow-up liver ultrasound done afterwards to make sure all the fat has been eradicated. But it doesn't work if you continue to drink alcohol, if you continue to eat in a caloric surplus, if you continue not to exercise, if you continue to do stuff that's bad for the liver, your liver won't heal. It's kind of like if you have a broken leg. If you keep trying to run on it, it's not going to heal. So this is very, very effective. And if people get a bit of a digestive discomfort from this, it's not because the supplement is irritating your gut. It's because the fat is leaving the body in the form of elimination. Fat, when it's warm, is liquid. The fat has to go somewhere to get out of your body. So the other thing that I want to add in, and it kind of blows my mind that this is something that I have to bring up all the time, because I have to bring it up all the time. If you've had your gallbladder removed, you need to replace the function of the gallbladder. If you remove the thing surgically, which needs to be removed due to a medical event, if you remove the thing that makes bile, you need to replace the bile that thing was making. If you remove a gland from the body, you need to replace its function. Otherwise, you're going to have a problem. And the problem tends to be a long-term thing. And when you lack bile production because you removed the bile-producing factory, you're not going to break down fats, and then you're not going to be able to absorb and assimilate fat-soluble nutrients. So adding 125 to 250 milligrams of ox bile for women, or 500 milligrams of ox bile with fat-containing meals for men, as well as a bioavailable fat-soluble nutrient complex to further support preventing a deficiency, is integral. And if you do not have a gallbladder, you need to replace the function of the bile. So the next one that comes up a lot is hypothyroidism. And I have a full thyroid masterclass. I have a thyroid kind of 101 style Beyond TRT lecture. I have an ebook on this. I have a ton of information. So I'm not going to do the full 2-hour thyroid lecture again here right now. I'm going to give a general summary of how this contributes to the side effects. So subclinical hypothyroidism can be caused by hypogonadism, meaning low testosterone. Hypogonadism can also be caused by hypothyroidism when it is Hashimoto's, meaning it's autoimmune. So it's very important to determine the thyroid status as a part of the initial diagnosis for low testosterone and onboarding, because there is a huge crossover between low testosterone symptoms and low thyroid symptoms. They're basically the same. It's just that there can be a different emphasis on which symptoms are worse. One of the big misconceptions is that if you have hypothyroidism, you're always going to be cold. This can be the case, and often is, especially when it's severe, but this is more commonly a symptom in women because women have a lower basal temperature than men. So this symptom tends to be more symptomatic, more of a driving cause for seeking out the treatment than it is in men. There's a couple of reasons why this is important. One is that thyroid is less invasive. So if you have hypothyroidism and you can resolve that and therefore increase your testosterone levels, this is less of an invasive treatment. You're not shutting down your testosterone production. Now, the severe hypothyroidism that has been shown in literature and in my experience can and often is the root cause of hypogonadism. So if someone has Hashimoto's hypothyroidism, which can be diagnosed either via, or ideally via, an ultrasound of the thyroid and elevations in ATPO and ATG antibodies, this is something that needs to be treated either before starting TRT or if the patient also has primary testicular failure at the same time. Now, the other factor of this, and this is complicated, so there's a whole masterclass on this topic if people are going, what on earth are you talking about? The other side of the coin is that most of the time when someone has low testosterone, they also have suboptimal thyroid function. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. This is because of the stress state that comes with low testosterone. So low testosterone can cause mild subclinical hypothyroidism, but severe low thyroid will be the root cause of low testosterone. So it's important to understand which is primary and which is secondary. And this is a skill requirement of the practitioner who is steering the ship. So there can always be the same root cause for why both of these secondary issues could be occurring: malnutrition, chronic stress, pain, psychiatric medications, poor diet, poor lifestyle. So just like with hypogonadism, it is, I've said here important, but I'm going to rephrase it as integral. It is integral to determine whether the poor diet and lifestyle practices are as a result of the low hormone state, or if the low hormone state is the driving factor why the diet and lifestyle is off. So we have to look at this and say, okay, which is the chicken or the egg? Is the diet and lifestyle crap because the hormones suck and the person feels like shit, and therefore they're looking after themselves in a way that's maladaptive because it doesn't matter what they do, they feel like crap anyway, so they're going to have the burger, they're going to have the beers? Or are the hormones suppressed and problematic because the individual isn't looking after themselves properly? A lot of people who I've met have terrible hormone profiles because they look after themselves like shit. And they feel and function exactly the way that they are supposed to based on how they're living. If patients are hearing this and going, I can't do that, of course you can't. It's the practitioner's job to do this. It's your job to provide them with all the information, all the lab testing, and everything in place so that they can determine that. And it is their responsibility in terms of their competency to actually know what they are doing to be able to work out what is in your best interest. That is their job. So I recommend running reverse T3 and thyroid antibodies to get the full picture for thyroid function. I've covered reverse T3 in the thyroid masterclass. I know it's an expensive lab test. I know some people say that it's not needed. It is an important lab test if it is known how to interpret it properly. Waking temperatures is the old school way of determining hypothyroidism before they were able to actually pull a serum thyroid measurement. I don't use waking temperatures in replacement of lab testing, but it can be a useful, very easy, and once you buy a $5 or $10 thermometer, basically free, way to get a second vantage point of what's going on with aspects related to metabolic health and ultimately the thyroid. So waking temperatures should be between 97.8 and 98.2 Fahrenheit. If this is low, this can be a secondary confirmation that the thyroid is suboptimal. As I said before, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. This can be caused by, as well as induce, hypothyroidism. All of this stuff is connected, which is why we have to look at everything. I do not overcomplicate this stuff for the sake of overcomplicating it. This is the sufficient amount of complication for the fact that the body is a complicated series of interconnected systems. And if we're going to come in and hijack one integral process, we need to understand a viewpoint of how everything else that is impacting it and is impacted by it is also operating. It's important for patients to understand that hypothyroidism causes them to have a slow metabolism. This is where these calories out calculators that people use or some personal trainer got can be drastically incorrect. And patients can become then despondent and discouraged. And it can also lead to malnutrition if they continue to push their calories lower and lower and lower and lower to ultimately lose body fat. Now, personal trainers often cannot have an explanation beyond the client simply not tracking their macros properly, maybe saying, oh, you're not tracking your sources, you're not weighing your food cooked or raw or whatever people are supposed to be doing. And then when the patient's like, no, I am, The personal trainer goes, oh, well, that's impossible. You mustn't be reporting things properly. And it doesn't lead to a resolution for the patient. They end up becoming frustrated, despondent, and quitting the exercise regime. It's so important that if personal trainers actually want to be able to help their patients and clients in this case, that they can identify when something is not responding the way it should be and refer to experts for blood work and treatment if that is required. This can be such a beneficial relationship between the people who are working on the ground with the patients and clients and people who are working to oversee their health and hormones, if this is well understood and this relationship is a mutually respectful and collaborative effort. Now, personally, I find natural desiccated thyroid to be more effective in practice than the equivalent T3, T4 doses. But in some cases, there can be situations where the individual will respond better, or they simply can't get things like thyroid, meaning that T3 and T4 will be a better option. So I'm going to quickly cover off a few thyroid points specifically just relating to the TRT side effects. Again, this is much more comprehensively covered in the Thyroid Masterclass. I think thyroid is probably a bigger topic than TRT because there can be this autoimmune factor to it. But if someone is going to be looking at thyroid treatment, it's important to titrate up in small increments. The TSH and T3 feedback loop does not always function properly, especially if there are pituitary issues or damage to the thyroid from long-term Hashimoto's, meaning that the TSH may need to be suppressed. And I discussed this a lot more in the masterclass. It's important to resolve other root causes, which may be raising TSH and reverse T3, such as chronic stress, prolonged caloric restriction, chronic injuries, poor sleep, diet and lifestyle practices, etc., rather than just throwing thyroid hormone at the problem. I think this is where some practitioners suffer from the Dunning-Kruger effect. Addressing stress management is an integral part, and I'm going to use that word again because I don't have a better word for it. It's an integral part of treating the thyroid because the baseline thyroid production is still present to some degree, and thyroid receptor function, as well as conversion of T4 into the active T3 hormone, is still regulated by biological processes. So you can throw all the thyroid hormone at a patient that you want, but if they are still in a chronic stress state, you're not going to be able to resolve the hypothyroid symptoms. You might be able to improve them, but you're not going to be able to solve them. So again, addressing the root cause issue is important, but things, again, phosphatidylserine, CBD, higher doses of glycine, theanine, magnesium, especially in combination, as well as things like mindfulness meditation, stretching and mobility work, proper hydration, having a set bedtime, actually getting enough fucking sleep. All of this stuff is equally important to the thyroid dose itself. And without these things in place, the thyroid dose may not actually work. So introducing TRT will usually boost thyroid function a little bit. So if the hypothyroidism is only mild and is not autoimmune, it is worth waiting a 3 to 6 month period to dial in the TRT to see how the thyroid responds, because it will often self-resolve. It won't self-resolve if it's autoimmune. So chronic pain. I have had I'm not going to say fair share because I've had way more than my fair share. I have had a lot of experience with chronic pain due to spinal injuries. Therefore, this has been a key area of interest for myself. And it is something that comes up all the time with the troubleshooting cases that I primarily these days work with. I mainly do complex troubleshooting issues. So in my experience, both personally and with clients, chronic pain causes similar side effects to obesity regarding TRT. And this is due to systemic increased inflammation, but it's coming from a different root cause. So if someone has got chronic pain issues, stop blasting peptides, stop taking 20 fucking supplements a day when you are not actively working on the issue. Stretching and mobility, dynamic yoga, all of these things. There are so many amazing follow along YouTube things that you can do every single day for pain, as well as training in a way that is rehabilitating and strengthening the weak areas of the body. There are so many amazing people who've contributed so much incredible content. People like the knees over toes guy. There are amazing physios that you can work with. Paul Chek, I think, is the king of this. Working with a Chek practitioner can be life-changing. My friend Luke Lehman, as well as Max at Muscle Nerds, they are fantastic for this as well. You can contact them. I have no financial affiliation with them. They can help very, very, very strongly with these issues, because a lot of the time people are not working on the issue. They're just training around it. Now, when the issue is being worked on, or if it cannot be resolved, antioxidants and natural health-promoting anti-inflammatories can often make immense positive impacts on physical and mental health in conjunction with TRT, because they offset and prevent the unfavorable metabolism of testosterone, as well as supporting the low androgen receptor binding from the testosterone itself. Hormones don't do anything until they activate a receptor. So if the receptors are not functioning properly, the hormones are not going to do the thing that they should be doing in the body. So chronic pain and inflammation is anti-dopaminergic. As I said before, it increases reuptake, which is like the opposite of an SSRI, but for dopamine. So it clears it out faster. It reduces synthesis. It means the receptors don't work properly, and it reduces production, and it increases prolactin, which is even more anti-dopaminergic. You're also having reduction in thyroid function. You're having dysregulation of the endocannabinoid system. And then you're also getting this massively reduced quality of life because you're subjectively in pain. So it is important to look at pain as a biological issue. And it is so key to work on supporting the inflammation, not just using anti-inflammatory drugs to suppress these pathways, but working on the consequences of the inflammation with chronic pain patients on TRT to support their baseline energy. If someone's in pain and feels like shit, they're not going to have good compliance with the rehab protocols. So supporting them feeling better and then giving them the tools and the guidance to actually do the rehabilitation massively improves the compliance, which, as Stan Efferding says, compliance is the science for correcting the root cause of the pain long term. So, as I said, chronic pain is extremely problematic for the vessel, for the body. It will suppress the production of androgens. So if we're in a situation where we can increase the androgens, this can be supportive on the effects of chronic pain, but it doesn't resolve where the pain's coming from. But a more androgenic mental state and a less catabolic physical environment is very favorable for improving the outcomes from the physical therapy. So supplements, CBD, CBDA, which is raw CBD, extremely beneficial, overlooked. I discussed this on the Mark Bell podcast, and Doka make a fantastic 50 milligram version, less sedating, more anti-inflammatory. You can check that out. Glucosamine, MSM, as I said, high quality, high strength fish oil, NAC, cortisol modulators such as phosphatidylserine, all of these things together with TRT, with physical therapy, this is what makes the difference. As I said, supplements will not resolve the root cause, but it can help the body better manage the consequence of the root cause. Now, when someone's chronically inflamed, it's also very important to check pregnenolone and DHEA levels. This can reduce their production, but also optimizing these levels only when they are deficient can also massively help with healing and dealing with the increased stress environment. You can check out the Beyond TRT lectures. You can check out the Pregnenolone Masterclass. You can check out the Beyond TRT ebook. I go into way more detail on that there. So glutathione, magnesium infusions together can be very helpful for people who can access these. And the last point that I will make, and I will caveat this with saying you need to be careful with this because there can be contraindications. But if sleep is a major factor due to pain and you can access this, micro doses of THC can be extremely helpful with supporting sleep and recovery, but not past a point that it is producing a recreational high. 1.25 to 2.5 to even 5 milligrams of THC orally meaning it is orally ingested, not orally inhaled, so that it has a longer, smoother half-life. It has better pharmacokinetics for managing sleep and inflammation overnight. This can be very helpful, but you need to make sure that THC is not a contraindication for any of your mental health, and high doses of regular THC use are, I'm very sorry about this, but it is anti-androgenic. It blocks the androgen receptor, and it also can create dysregulation of the endocannabinoid system and ultimately put someone into a situation where they could even be a little bit worse off than they were before using it. So be very careful, work with a professional on that, but there is a high reward to risk ratio for the right person using the right dose and the right delivery mechanism, especially balanced with at least a 1-to-1 ratio of CBD. Now, we're going to get into the final point. The sun has set, the lighting has changed. If anyone's going to whinge about that in the comments, shut up. We're going to talk about SHIT protocols. And SHIT protocol is the bane of my existence, because this is the easiest thing for practitioners to get right. Everything I mentioned before is much more complicated in terms of patient compliance. It's much more complicated in terms of a much broader knowledge base being required. This is simple. So testosterone must be injected as often as the patient is willing to do it. Daily is king. And any argument to this is wrong. When we look at testosterone, there are things that people get wrong because they don't intrinsically understand pharmacokinetics or the studies that they are reading. And by reading, I mean Googling and glancing at the abstract. Firstly, testosterone enanthate and cypionate do not have a half-life of a week. They have a half-life of under 5 days. They have a mean residence time of 7 to 10 days. But the important thing to understand about pharmacokinetics is people say that if you do a fortnightly or weekly or twice a week injection of testosterone, after 8 weeks, you will reach what's called a steady state. This does not mean a flat line. Steady state means that the levels stay within a therapeutic range as defined by what that therapeutic range is, meaning that they're going to be fluctuating up and down, but not crashing through a therapeutic floor. The problem that we have in this movement is the variability, because testosterone's therapeutic effects and the lack of side effects, whether people agree with this or not, it is simply the truth, come from stability. If you ask any woman, she will tell you that hormone fluctuations are not conducive for her mental health. They are not conducive for any aspect of a man's health. Even if you want to argue about the natural diurnal rhythm of testosterone, you cannot mimic that, because the level of it being mimicked is a very small fluctuation, and the pharmacokinetic mimicking would need to start at midnight. So daily injections actually do lead to a natural slight fluctuation in levels because of these pharmacokinetic peaks. So just like caffeine has a half-life of 8 hours, it doesn't have a gradual increase at up to 4 hours and then a gradual decrease in the desired effects. So when you have a cup of coffee, the effects you're looking to achieve are not gradually building for 4 hours and then gradually tapering off over 8 hours. This is because caffeine peaks much earlier than the middle of the half-life. So when we are looking to stabilize androgen levels, which is what confers the best therapeutic outcomes, especially in the instance of resolving side effects, daily injections. The way to make daily injections easier is to use a 29-gauge insulin syringe into the deltoid. Subcutaneous injections are not reliable. Intramuscular injections work 100% of the time. There are hundreds of thousands of diabetic little girls who do a daily injection of insulin into the subcutaneous fat just to survive. You as a full-grown adult looking to optimize their androgen levels can do the same thing into the deltoid. Scar tissue is not an issue when you're using a tiny little needle, and the patience of doing this as part of your daily routine, if you are dealing with side effects especially, has a massive reward profile to it. Now, a lot of people get away with 3 times a week injections. And if you're not having side effects, I don't know why you're still watching this video, but Most people who are watching this are watching it because they're troubleshooting. I used to sell mobile phones when I was at university, and it was back in the day before, phones were this all-in-one thing that we have now, back when you could take the battery out. And when people would come in with a problem with their phone, the first thing we'd ask them, and if people are, as old as me or a bit older, we'd say, have you tried taking the battery out and turning it off and back on again? This is a hard reset. This would basically reset any software bugs. And most of the time, issues with the phone, unless you dropped it, back before they were waterproof, maybe you dropped it in the pool or put it through the washing machine, I don't know. But most of the issues could be resolved with a hard reset. Now, if it didn't resolve that, then we had to send it off for repair and further issues. But increasing injection frequency is like doing a hard reset. It doesn't solve everything, but it's the easiest thing for you to do first before seeing if other areas need to be investigated. Don't spend $1,000 on lab tests and come and spend an hour with me or an hour with someone else and do all these investigations and waste all this time on YouTube and blah, 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 before just trying to do daily injections. Yes, it's inconvenient, but once you get used to it, if you're doing something 3 times a week and having side effects, and you do the same thing 7 times a week and it resolves the issue, that is a worthwhile investment of your time. Plus, if you're doing it daily and you can use a 29 gauge instead of a 27 gauge, this tiny little pinprick is so comfortable and the process is so efficient that you can do it as part of your daily routine. And if you're not willing to do that, at least for a trial, I would be arguing that your side effects aren't that bad. So 3 times a week, people can get away with. Every other day, some people can get away with. Again, 3 times a week, every other day. If you're doing well on that, if you're thriving on that, then that is not a problem. But twice a week, I would argue, is the minimal amount that anyone should be looking at. But if you're having side effects, one of the best things that you can do that is free, that is easy, that is efficient, stabilize those levels and see if things improve. So if you're in the UK, you may be using Sustanon. I'm not a fan of Sustanon, but I'm also not a fan of how much TRT costs in the UK. I am under the impression, at least as of 2025, and it has been for the last 5 years, that Sustanon is orders of magnitude cheaper. I'm not talking about 20 or 30 bucks a month. I'm talking a tenth of the price. If that is a factor, you can make Sustanon work, but you have to do daily injections because of the presence of the propionate and phenylpropionate esters, meaning that it is going to be too unstable, not in terms of your levels crashing out to nothing, but having too much flux and variance in the levels to have stability. So if you're using Sustanon and you're having side effects, do it daily. If you are using Sustanon and you are not in the UK, or it is not the only form of testosterone that you can get, consider using cypionate or enanthate because it is more stable, and stability is very important for resolving side effects. But as I have said for this entire lecture, if there are other issues going on that are not related to the pharmacokinetics, meaning the movement of the hormone levels in your body, this is not going to solve the issue, but it may help to resolve some of the discomfort and side effects while you are working on or diagnosing the other issue. More stable hormones are going to be beneficial for any side effect scenario. Any argument to the contrary is wrong. Anyone who would like to debate that, please reach out to me. We can set up a discussion on it. I would love to be challenged on this point. So, compounded testosterone creams. Now, this is something that I have done a lot more work with. I've done a lot more practitioner education on since making this lecture. Compounded transscrotal creams need to ideally be applied twice a day and compounded in an increased bioavailability base, such as ideally the HRT base, also Versa, Atrivus, or liposomal. I prefer liposomal or HRT base. I find they work more consistently. A lot of people I work with use the Versa base and have no problems. A lot of people use the Atrivus base and have no problems. The HRT base is objectively the best. I find the liposomal absorbs better, has less residue left afterwards. Studies say that it isn't quite as good as Atrivus and Versa. In practice, the difference is negligible and the cream is often more available in terms of where you can get it, and it works very well. Regular commercial preparations of cream like Andro Forte or other shelf-based products are often far too low in concentration and they often do not have enough bioavailability to increase levels to a therapeutic point. Now, once a day, people can get away with, but it is far from optimal because there is, again, too much transience in the levels. But because of more conversion to DHT and less conversion to aromatase, this does tend to be better tolerated, but it's far from ideal. Now, this is the point that I want to bring up here, which is more of a modern and nuanced approach that I have field tested with teams of over a dozen doctors in more than a dozen countries, is that if someone is having side effects related to any of the things I've mentioned before, obesity, liver disease, chronic pain, hypothyroidism, creams, when used properly, i.e. 20% concentration or 15% concentration if someone's a hyperresponder, twice a day in a liposomal HRT base or Versa retrievers, because the testosterone goes directly into the bloodstream when applied to the scrotum and has increased presence of the 5-alpha reductase enzyme, this can actually replicate an environment that is more like that of a healthy man. Because if the liver is dysfunctional and the ester is not being metabolized properly, a lot of the problems that we have from over aromatizing in obese or inflamed patients is also a problem due to underproduction of the 5-alpha reductase enzyme. All of the issues that I mentioned before result in suppressed production of 5-alpha reductase, not just increased aromatase. So if we can use a form of testosterone which bypasses the liver, goes directly into the bloodstream, and has a more androgenic metabolism profile, I can say from experience, overseeing hundreds of these cases with men who would usually have side effects while we are resolving the root cause issue, that the cream delivers the results that is more in alignment with what a healthy man would have on injections. I have seen this. I have taught this. I have had a huge amount of practitioners come back to me and attest to this being true. It doesn't mean the cream is better. It doesn't mean that injections are better. It means that it is important for practitioners to have both options in the toolbox. And one thing that men can do if they're wanting to use injections for convenience or, for whatever reason, it doesn't really matter, it's your treatment, is to use the cream until the body fat percentage is healthy, until the liver issues have been resolved, until the habits have been resolved, and then swapping to injections and having them be better tolerated. So men in poorer health who have hypogonadism for longer periods prior to treatment will be more sensitive to the fluctuations in testosterone levels and need to administer the treatment more often. So to put it simply, everyone should inject daily, but the more unhealthy you are, the more of an emphasis on you have to inject more often to not have side effects. If you are unhealthy and have these problems that I mentioned before, and you do a twice-a-week injection protocol, you will have a much higher probability, again, not a guarantee, but a much higher probability of side effects. Now, when people are titrating their protocols, I recommend titrating by the minimal amount that you can measure on the syringe per injection. So if you're doing a daily injection with either a 200 milligram per mil or 250 milligram per mil, the titration increment on the 1 mil insulin syringe will be 4 or 5 milligrams per injection, meaning that if I don't really work with 200 milligram per mil because of the countries I'm in, so 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24. So you're looking at about 28 to 35 milligrams per week of testosterone in titrations up and down. If you're doing 3 injections per week, that would be a 12 to 15 milligram amount for titrating. People will say, oh, well, that's not very much. It is much better to titrate in the minimal amount more frequently than a big jump. So for example, if someone did need double that amount of titration, it's better to titrate by the minimal amount for 12 to 16 weeks, review it, and then titrate by that point again so that the body can get used to these changes in androgens rather than overshooting it. Because a lot of the time, again, this is in practice, and I can tell you this from experience, is that sometimes it's not that the dose was too high, it's that you got there too quickly. So if someone's never drank coffee before, let's say they've never had more than 1 shot of espresso per day, and for some reason they're wanting to go up to, let's say, 3 shots of espresso per day, again, hypothetical. Going from 1 shot to 2 shots to 3 shots is going to be a better outcome than going straight to 3 shots, because it may not be that 3 shots is too much. It can be that 3 shots is too much straight away. And people need time for not just the subjective benefits of testosterone, but for the body to be able to adjust and accommodate around those changing hormone environments. Now, the other thing that's important is that levels can fluctuate up to 30%, maybe even a little bit more than that, even with daily injections. So if you are using the same testosterone product and you get your blood work every morning when you get it at 9 a.m., and you do your testosterone shot every day at, let's say, 9:30 a.m., for example, even with those ultra stable levels in your blood, your levels can and will fluctuate by 30% or maybe even a little bit more when you get your labs drawn. This is not a problem. This is because even though the amount of testosterone that you're administering is the same, the amount present in your blood will vary because, 1, the test is not pinpoint, but 2, the liver doesn't consistently metabolize the ester. It will vary based on the fact that the body is quite dynamic. So this is why it's important for practitioners to understand that the number on paper is a ballpark number. It's not a precise number. And if providers keep tweaking reactively based on the exact pinpoint number in the lab test, the patients are going to have an absolute nightmare of an experience. This is why symptoms and labs are important together in determining what to do with a protocol. So your protocol, you listening to this now, is based on what the optimal replacement dose is for you. We can't test, and maybe if you're watching this in the future, this has changed, but we can't test how many androgen receptors you have. We can't test how sensitive they are. And people could be watching this who are 19 years old. People could be watching this who are 80 years old. People could be watching this who are healthy athletes or morbidly obese alcoholics and everything in between. So comparing doses with other people, if they are not your identical twin with the exact health parameters as you, is like comparing apples to oranges. So for me personally, when I'm coaching doctors and working and overseeing doctors in my clinics, I prefer to start individuals on cream rather than injections if they are obese. And this is due to, as I said before, the increased DHT conversion and the decreased aromatase expression from this form of administration more being representative of what a healthy man would have on injections. And this leads to better outcomes. The only time that this does not work is if the individual doesn't properly absorb the cream, in which case daily injections with things like metformin and other ancillaries can absolutely work. Not everyone can get compounded HRT-based 20% testosterone cream. So my preference for injections, if possible, is an MCT-based oil. And in terms of if you're working with a pharmacy directly, the name for this can often be Migliol, which is like a commercial name for MCT. I prefer this for 2 reasons. One is that the MCT oil is thinner. It's the thinnest oil. If you compare this to like a commercial Primatest and castor oil on the other end of the spectrum, this is a very thick, viscous oil. It's like goo. This oil is closer to water. So that means that when you're drawing and injecting with a little tiny syringe, like a 29 gauge syringe, it's much more convenient and faster. Like just convenience is great. The other thing though, is it's less immunogenic. And this is something I picked up in maybe 2021, 2022, and other colleagues of mine have also picked this up as well, because when you work with clients or patients at scale, the issues that come up 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 times come up multiple times a week or even multiple times a day. And a lot of people, and again, when I say a lot of people, I mean a lot of people when you're dealing with thousands of men, I would estimate 1 in 10 to 1 in 20 can have an immunogenic reaction to some of these commercial oils or carrier oils. Whereas the MCT oil doesn't really seem to have a capacity for the immune system to respond negatively. So when people get flu-like symptoms, when people get swelling around the injection site, when they get increased acne, even though all their other health factors and hormone replacement therapy is optimal, one thing that people can look at, and practitioners should look at as well, is using an MCT-based oil. So that is the last point that I have today. That is my overview of points that I think can help people with troubleshooting their TRT. Thank you for watching the full lecture. I hope that helped you. I hope that answered some of your questions, and I will see you all on the next video. When the thyroid is low and not functioning properly, everything slows down. And as a result of everything slowing down, this can have a variety of biological and psychological consequences. If someone has an autoimmune condition, or they have poor diet and lifestyle practices which are causing thyroid issues, these will not